All right, next up we've got Daniel Hourigan. Hey, Daniel.
Hey, how you going?
Good. So let's start with a little background on yourself.
Okay, so I've worked in the VFX industry for about 15 years, mainly in film. And in the last 2 years, I've sort of transitioned to teaching at CG Spectrum. And I've become really interested in how people learn, specifically how people learn Houdini and how I can better teach Houdini to students to get them into it and really so they understand and so they can just be able to create whatever they like without barriers. So that's what my passion is now.
And what's your presentation today going to be about?
So my presentation is about how I teach students to get into Houdini and how I can sort of clear away some of those, the fog of understanding in Houdini, trying to get people to work out how it works at a fundamental level before they progress into the more complex ideas. And just sort of, yeah, dispelling some of those myths about Houdini being, a challenging and difficult program to get into.
Excellent. Looking forward to it. Well, let's get started.
Cool. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining me. Today I'm going to talk about learning Houdini and some of the things I've learnt over the years, both as a VFX artist for film and television, and over the last couple of years as a lecturer and mentor. As the head of effects at CG Spectrum, I have recently been redeveloping our courses to improve student understanding and to help students get the best results they can from Houdini. Recently, I've done a lot of thinking about how best to teach Houdini, as it can be a difficult subject to learn. I myself struggled with it when I first started. I came from a different software and that, I think, made it more difficult. But there are so many new concepts to learn and remember when you're first starting out. It took me a few years to really understand things, but I think I could have got there sooner if I had really focused on learning the fundamentals. So I want to share with you the things that I've learned and the information that I now share with all my students in an effort to fast track their learning and comprehension of Houdini. And hopefully it'll help you too. So the first thing that I talk about with people when they're getting into Houdini is that everyone is different. Everyone learns in different ways and everyone works in different ways. Everyone's minds are wired to think differently. And Houdini is for everyone. You don't have to be particularly technical or particularly artistic to do things in Houdini. So you can work whichever way that you like to work. There are lots of different types of artists. Some people like to look at a big wall of code and they love nothing more than writing VEX in Houdini. Then there are those people that like to use more visual means of creation through using nodes with user interfaces and controls that they can just, change and see what happens on the screen. Then there are those people that like both of those methods. So they do a bit of code and they do a bit of more artistic controls. And those people are really strong in Houdini because they sort of, they can do a bit of everything. So that's a good place to be. It's the best thing about Houdini, though, is that you don't have to be one way or the other. There are just so many ways of doing the same effect. I think if you gave the same effect or the same task to 10 different artists, you would probably get back 10 completely different solutions to that task. There's no right or wrong answer. Some ways are more efficient than others, and that's something that you'll learn in time through Houdini and from other artists. But there is no right or wrong way to do something. It's down to how you thought about solving the problem and the creative approach that you took to get there. The exciting thing about Houdini is that you can literally do anything. And that's what I love about it. I worked for a long time in film and visual effects using another software. And after about 10 years of using that and frequently coming across these brick walls that you just couldn't get around, there were limitations with the software. There might have been technical limitations, and you just couldn't do anything about it. That was it. But then I learned Houdini and the whole world opened up to me again. I could get around those brick walls. They weren't really brick walls. They were more my own personal brick walls in understanding Houdini. And once I kind of learnt more, I could overcome them. And that's really exciting to not have limitations in Houdini. You hit these brick walls and challenges, and it's just about solving problems and learning new techniques. The only thing that constrains you in Houdini is your own knowledge of Houdini and how the nodes work and how the fundamental ideas come together to produce effects. You'll hear people talk about proceduralism in Houdini, procedural modeling, procedural workflows. Proceduralism really just means that the effect has been produced using non-manual methods. No manual selecting, no specific groups of points, etc. A series of nodes or processes that end up with a certain result. The cool thing with proceduralism is that it's incredibly flexible. You can take a procedural setup and apply it to almost anything and it will still work. And a lot of the nodes that you put down in Houdini are procedural, so anything that you plug into them, they will still work and update accordingly. It's also very easy to change any part of the network that you've created if you've built it in a procedural way. And this is the reason why Houdini has become so widely adopted and popular, because it's so flexible and you can reuse everything that you create over and over again. In a commercial sense, that is really valuable because it saves you a lot of time rebuilding setups over and over again, which is what we used to do. But proceduralism isn't everything. Setting keyframes and hand selecting points, painting attributes, it's not illegal. You can do it if you want to. Don't let anyone shame you for manually creating a group. Whilst it does make a setup more flexible, sometimes it's just faster to do something manually. If an artist takes 4 days to make a fancy procedural setup that another artist does in 3 hours using keyframes and manual selections, then I know which one the client will be more happy with. If you can do things faster, it's usually better. Sometimes manual methods get the job done, and it gets it done fast. In the VFX industry, sometimes you may only have a few hours to make a change. It's good to know the pros and cons of each method, and then use them appropriately. It's easy to get lost in the design of an elaborate system, making it all procedural, having it do all these fancy things that might not be needed. You lose sight of the actual goal, which is, perhaps just to create some bullet hits or something like that. One thing that I've learned through my own learning and now as a teacher is that often when you're doing a tutorial, you're missing out on a lot of information, and I find that it's not necessarily the best way to learn. Some tutorials are better than others, but I find that when you're watching a tutorial, you're just being shown a series of steps to achieve a very specific outcome. And quite often you're not told why each node is being used, you're just being told to use it and to put in these particular values. And that's not great for learning because you're not really understanding why. So the thing that you miss out on when you're watching these tutorials is the development of the effect. Watching that artist or that teacher create that effect from scratch and solving the problems that show up when they do that, because inevitably there will be little problems that they have to solve or things that didn't work. You miss out on that. So that's something that you need to be aware of when you're doing tutorials. I did a lot of Houdini tutorials when I was first learning, and whilst at the end I had something that looked pretty cool, it didn't really help me understand how everything worked. I sort of, if you do enough of them, I think you can sort of start to build up a bit of a memory about which nodes do what, but you still don't really fundamentally understand how everything's working and what's going on underneath some of those nodes. So I think it's really important to think about the why and question, why is this node being used? What does this node do? How else can I use this node? Why did you choose those values? So tutorials are great. I mean, it is the way that most people learn, but it's important to recognize that you are missing out on a huge step, which is the sort of developmental and playing around stage. So you need to do that on your own. It's important to practice outside of the tutorial so that you start to gain an understanding of how to do these things by yourself. What you end up with at the end of a tutorial is you've created this nice effect, but then if someone asked you to do it from scratch without following a tutorial or a support file, sometimes you find it quite difficult to remember all those steps. And part of that is because you don't really understand how everything works yet. So my advice to anyone starting out is to learn the basics. Learn those fundamental ideas that form the building blocks for many complex effects in Houdini. Learn about attributes, what they are, how to create them, how to modify them, all the different ways that you can modify them. You can use Vex, you can use VOPs, you can use some of the preset Houdini nodes that are provided for you. There are so many ways to create and modify attributes that it's not just one way or the other. So learn about all the different ways that you can do that. Understand the common attributes that are present everywhere in Houdini with any sort of geometry. Attributes like P and N, which describe the position of the object in space and the way that it might look when it's lit. Learn to read the geometry spreadsheet. The geometry spreadsheet is something that I avoided like the plague when I first started getting into Houdini, because it was a whole bunch of numbers that didn't mean anything to me. All I wanted to do was blow stuff up and make cool explosions and fire, and these numbers, they were meaningless. I didn't understand. And I didn't understand attributes either, so that's why. But once you do start learning about attributes and how to create them and the data that they're generating, the geometry spreadsheet becomes incredibly important in being able to visualize that information. And through that, you can see if something's working or not as well. If you're creating attributes and the values in the geometry spreadsheet aren't updating or they're 0, then you might have some problem with your code or some problem in the network. So it can show up errors as well, and it's an incredibly useful tool to use. So don't avoid it like I did. And there are more than just point attributes on geometry. There are primitive attributes, vertex attributes, and detail attributes. So it's important to understand when and where to use those different attributes and what each one can help you do. And then finally, use markers. Learn how to visualize data in the viewport. So as well as the geometry spreadsheet, which gives you all of the numbers in a spreadsheet, you can use markers to actually display that data on the geometry. And I find that incredibly important when I'm writing Vex, and that's a bit more of an abstract kind of concept when I'm looking at a line of code. But using a marker to visualize that data that I'm generating on the geometry itself gives it a bit of context and a bit of visual meaning to me. So learning how to use markers and create them in the viewport is really important in understanding everything that you're doing. I've taught many students over the last few years, and one thing I've realized is that the students that have a goal when they're trying to learn something do a lot better, and they have an easier time of coming to terms with learning and learning a difficult software. Without a goal, you're sort of, you're a bit aimless, and you don't really know where you're going, what the point is, or which way to go first. And so you're a little bit lost. But when you're learning anything, whether it's Houdini or guitar or whatever it might be, I think it's important to have a goal, because you can set yourself some endpoint and work towards it. So I think that's really important. If you have a goal, for example, like I want to create an awesome explosion, then you have a starting point. You can start researching. You can start looking at real explosions and figure out what you need. You can start writing down the different things that you see. Okay, so we've got a fireball, we've got a shockwave, we've got sparks and smoke trails. And then you know what you need to start with. And if you don't know how to do those things, then you know what you need to start researching. How to create a shockwave in Houdini, how to create a fireball. Start looking at the shelf tools or looking for tutorials that do those things. Maybe it's as simple as saying, I need to learn Pyro because that's how I'm going to create all of these effects. Maybe your goal is about learning procedural modeling. And then you just start searching out and researching as much as you can, consuming information and trying to make sense of it all. But making sure that you're always trying to get towards your goal. If your goal is to become an effects artist, search out what you need to achieve that goal. Find out what effects artists in different companies do. Do they do modeling? Not much. So you don't really need to focus on that if all you want to be is an effects artist. You might need to learn a little bit, but you probably don't need to focus all your time on learning modeling. So having a goal and working out all the things that you need to achieve that goal is a really good way of learning anything. Having learn Houdini as your goal, though, might be too broad. So try to create smaller, specific goals within that. Like this month, I want to learn everything about flip or procedural modeling and go from there. Houdini is all about solving problems, and not just Houdini. Visual effects in general is about solving problems. So you're given a task and you have to work out how to do it. And that's problem solving. You need to come up with some method of turning, points into an interesting effect, whether it's an explosion or some sort of creeping virus or whatever it might be. It's really important that you practice solving problems. So if something doesn't work, try really hard to figure out why and understand why, and then learn how to fix it. 9 out of 10 files that I get presented with from students, they're very common things that everyone does when they're learning. So, and that's fine, that's expected. Yeah, we expect people to come across these problems, but I think it's important to learn how to recognize them, how to start figuring out how to solve these problems for yourself. It's fine to ask for help, but always asking for help doesn't help you understand how to solve your own problems. And when you want to start using Houdini in a professional sense, you're going to be expected to, want to fix your own problems a lot of the time. Unless they're really, really challenging problems that you need help with, then that's fine. But you are expected to be able to solve your own problems a lot of the time. Don't delete everything. I have students that tell me, I've deleted everything 5 or 6 times and rebuilt everything and I'm still having the same problem. Deleting everything, as tempting as it might be, and to start again, doesn't help you understand what is breaking. So rather than doing that and starting again, really try to go through everything and figure out what is the problem, what's causing it to break. Go through each node, check everything very closely and really try to understand. Try to understand what the error messages are as well. They may seem quite complicated, but really you just need to learn how to look at specific areas of what those error messages are telling you. And from there, you can sort of start to figure out what might be breaking. Create a common problems checklist for yourself. And when you come across something that isn't working, go through the checklist. If going through the checklist doesn't help find the issue, then start Googling the problem by typing simple keywords like object not updating, followed by Houdini, so that you get specific things related to object not updating in Houdini. Most issues are very well documented. Now, I think it's also important to dive inside nodes, open things up and play around with them. And don't be afraid to break things. Plug inputs in and out of different things and see what happens. All the nodes in Houdini, or a lot of them, are actually collections of nodes that have been wrapped up into nice little user interfaces that you can use. But if you see that lock icon on a node, it means that there is stuff inside it. So you can go in there and have a look at how it's been done. You can learn a lot from doing this. It might look scary and confusing at first with all those nodes, but start at the top and work your way down, trying to learn what each node does. I've made many of my own tools, materials, and setups by first looking at the Houdini provided nodes and figuring out how they went about creating it, and then trying to learn, and then taking that into my own tools. When you learn how the provided tools are working, you can make your own custom tools to do whatever you like, and that's really satisfying. It allows you to work more efficiently if you can build your own tools that you can bring in whenever you need them. And don't be afraid to break things. See what happens when you plug something into the wrong input. Maybe it'll create some effect that you didn't know about or that you might find really cool. I think you just have to have that that kind of take things apart mentality when you're playing with this stuff and trying to figure out how things work, like taking apart a radio when you're a kid or something. Just trying to find out how things work and just have that curiosity about how something is working the way it is. And don't be afraid to try and break it, because then you can learn that, oh, that doesn't work. And then you start learning about why it doesn't work or why it has to be the way that it is. So I think breaking things and then trying to fix them is a great way to learn. Well, I could talk about learning Houdini all day, but that's about all I have time for today. So if you're interested in what we have to offer at CG Spectrum, then I encourage you to check out the website. But if you have any questions or you want any advice, then please feel free to contact me as well. And I'm happy to talk to you more about learning Houdini and ways of getting into it. So thanks for watching.